Operational resilience is often assessed through risk reporting. Bruce McIndoe takes a different view. He explained that reporting supports governance, but it doesn't show whether an organization can continue to operate when conditions change. That distinction reshapes how leader thinks about operational resilience, risk management, and business resilience. Welcome back. You're listening to Risk Masters, the download, where I share bite-sized insights from our latest interviews. This highlight comes from a conversation with Bruce McIndoe, where we explore one of the central ideas from that episode. We break down why organizations often confuse risk reporting with operational resilience, and why that distinction matters for chief risk officers, business leaders, and those responsible for business resilience. Here is Bruce.
I think, and what we talked about before is working across organizations. I see immediately that managers, especially senior managers, confuse risk reporting with resilience. And risk registers, heat maps, they satisfy the governance, checkoff list, but they do not tell you or leadership whether the organization can still achieve its objectives when things change, right? So the bigger issue is that what I call the protective discipline. So that's the whole range of cyber, physical, business continuity, environmental health, HR, regulatory, audit, legal, all of those are there to protect the company, right? So these protective disciplines usually operate in fragmented silos throughout the organization. And those silos create blind spots, gaps, and failures of imagination. We hear about that, from a long time. So I say, real resilience requires an all of organizational view around uncertainty and dependencies, coordinating that action. So when I talk to senior managers, I say that boards need to quit asking the question, what are our top risks? What are they going to do with that, right? What they should be asking, what can prevent us from achieving our value generating objectives? And are we structured to detect those potential changes and decide and act on them to increase that certainty? So that's, I guess, the whole realm of, I think we're going to talk a lot about today.
Yes, and I suspect the answer to your question is no, but let's come back to it.
Oh, you want a simple answer? Okay.
It's always a little bit less black and white than that, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, and I think it's going to be a good segue to the example you were giving me before we started the show on the impact of the Iran war, right? When you look across sectors and industries, where does resilience more often fail? I would say slowly, quietly, somewhere in the background, rather than a big dramatically, a big failure.
Resilience usually fails quietly in the space between functions that are not connected, and long before it fails publicly, like in an actual crisis, right? So that's where I would say, and when I say between functions, there's a long list of things like weak handoffs and unclear ownership. Who's going to make those decisions? Outdated assumptions from 3 years ago, or even 3 months ago in the case of Iran, right? Again, I keep referring to the cross-functional coordination and those kinds of things. So, it's when a signal or an indicator is detected by one team and then not shared, right? So it's those things, but it also when dependencies aren't understood well also. And this is where the kind of the business continuity teams can come in and really help, clarify that. And the other one is, and I'm involved in this all the time, where, plans are helpful, but they're not a solution, right? You need to build muscle memory. You need to build capabilities, right? So so most failures that I see start from information and coordination failures before they become operational or crisis failures. So that would be my scope on that issue. And it's
And
not a yes or a no.
risk reporting provides visibility. It supports governance and oversight. But operation resilience is built in the execution. True resilience becomes visible in an organization that connects information, coordinate across functions, and act when conditions start to change. For chief risk officers and senior leaders, this shifts the focus from monitoring risk to understanding what can interrupt the delivery of business objectives. That is where risk management connects directly to business resilience. Listen to the full conversation with Bruce McIndoe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and at ivtm.com.
I guess this is why when you mentioned, focusing on internal controls, those are clean and easy to do, and people are comfortable with it, but they're lagging indicators, right? So I would say they miss. I guess they do originate outside, and they're missed not because there weren't any signals. And after action was, they always say, "Oh, we should have seen that coming," right? It's because they weren't looking, out far enough, horizon scanning. They weren't looking broadly across the domains or creatively enough, right? Kind of innovation and thinking about what's happening. So I would say, most organizations are better at kind of managing internal controls and scanning for future external, conditions. Then they are looking at those externals, so that they get surprised all the time because they're looking in the rearview mirror, not out the front windshield. Yeah.